I still remember that night, how cold the silence felt when my mother looked at me with eyes that no longer held love. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face carved from anger and disappointment. Her words cut through the air like glass. "You're not part of this family anymore," she said. I thought she was bluffing. I thought mothers didn't mean things like that. But I was wrong. It started a few months before that night, when I refused to take part in the family's business. My mother and stepfather ran a chain of high-end boutiques, a legacy she'd built with my late father. After his death, she remarried quickly, too quickly for me to process. Her new husband, Richard, was polished, persuasive, and controlling in quiet ways. He wanted expansion, new markets, bigger risks, and hidden deals that I knew were illegal. When I confronted her about it, she said, "You don't understand how the world works, Daniel. We do what we must to survive." But survival and deceit felt like different things to me. The argument grew until it felt like a wall between us. I left our house that night, my suitcase in hand, my mother's voice echoing after me, saying words no son should ever hear. I built a life without her, a modest one. I worked as a medical technician in a small hospital, paying rent month by month, living quietly. Birthdays passed without calls, Christmases without cards. And then, 6 years later, my phone rang. Her number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, nostalgia, guilt, maybe that unkillable thread between a mother and son, made me pick up. Her voice trembled. "Daniel, it's me. I need your help." She sounded weaker, older. The woman who once commanded boardrooms now struggled to breathe between words. "I'm sick," she said. "Kidney failure. They tested everyone in the family. No one's a match." My chest tightened. "And you think I am?" She hesitated. "You're the only one left." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the quiet hum of hospital machines through the phone. Somewhere deep down, I wanted to tell her no, to remind her that she'd thrown me out, cut me off like I was nothing. But then came the whisper of her sobs. And against every instinct, I agreed to see her. When I entered the hospital room, I barely recognized her. Her once perfect posture had wilted. Her skin, pale and fragile, clung to her bones. Tubes surrounded her like a web. Richard wasn't there. Of course not. It was always convenient for him to vanish when things got hard. "Daniel," she said softly, eyes glistening, "you look so much like your father." For a moment, I almost forgot everything. Almost. But memories don't fade that easily. I told her I would get tested. The results came back in 2 days. Perfect match. Doctors called it a miracle. I called it irony. Before the surgery, she reached out for my hand. "I know I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But if you help me, I swear I'll make things right." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that maybe this was life's strange way of repairing what was broken. The surgery went smoothly. I woke up in pain, but alive. She too recovered, slowly, steadily. The doctor said she'd been given a second chance at life. And maybe, I thought, so had we. Weeks later, when I was finally strong enough to walk, I went to visit her room. She was sitting upright, dressed, scrolling through her phone. For the first time, she smiled when she saw me. "Daniel," she said, "I was just about to call you. You've saved my life. I can never thank you enough." But as I stepped closer, I noticed Richard in the corner, whispering to someone on speakerphone. I caught fragments. Words like assets, recovery, signing tomorrow. Something cold twisted in my stomach. "Signing what?" I asked. Richard smiled without looking up. "Oh, just business. Nothing for you to worry about." My mother glanced away, her face unreadable. I left that day uneasy. A week later, I got a call from the family lawyer. Apparently, my mother had signed documents transferring full ownership of the company to Richard just days after her surgery. I froze. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. "He's my husband, Daniel," she said flatly. "He'll take care of things." "Take care of what?" I snapped. "Take everything?" She didn't answer. Her silence was worse than her rejection years ago. And then came the letter. Short, cold, and final. She thanked me for the kidney, for helping me survive, and ended with a sentence that burned itself into my memory. "I hope you someday understand that family isn't about blood, but about loyalty." I sat there, holding the letter, realizing the bitter truth. Sometimes saving someone's life doesn't save the relationship. Sometimes it only exposes what was never real to begin with. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with us yet. A few months passed, and I tried to forget her again. It was strange, really, how the body can heal faster than the heart. My surgical scar faded, but the memory of her words remained raw, like a wound that refused to close. I went back to my quiet routine at the hospital. I told myself I was fine. But some nights, when I'd caught my reflection under the dim kitchen light, I'd seen my father's eyes staring back. The same eyes she once said she loved. The same eyes she now couldn't look into without guilt. One evening, I was leaving work when a nurse from the nephrology department stopped me. "Daniel," she said, "you might want to see this." She handed me a copy of the hospital's charity records. I didn't understand at first why she was showing me donation logs, but then I saw the name, Richard Davenport Foundation. It had donated a large sum to the hospital's private transplant unit, the same month my mother's surgery had been done. My stomach twisted. I dug deeper. A friend in administration showed me files that weren't meant to be public. Richard had made a deal with one of the hospital board members. He'd promised financial backing in exchange for expedited priority for my mother's transplant. I realized what that meant. She hadn't been on the waiting list fairly. They'd used me, my body, because it was convenient, not because it was moral. And maybe the part that hurt most was that she knew. She'd known everything. I sat in my car for hours that night, watching the hospital lights flicker. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder. A kind of numb clarity. I realized she hadn't called because she missed me. She'd called because I was a match. A solution. A spare part. I didn't confront her right away. What was the point? She'd already shown me what loyalty meant to her. But the universe has a way of circling back, sometimes cruelly. About 3 months later, Richard's name appeared in the headlines. Businessman accused of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The police raided their main office. Millions had been siphoned from accounts. My mother's empire, the one she'd sacrificed everything to protect, crumbled overnight. I saw the news while sitting in the hospital cafeteria, a cup of stale coffee trembling in my hand. I didn't smile. I didn't even feel vindicated. It was just inevitable. 2 days later, she called again. Her voice was different this time. Hoarse, desperate, and hollow. "Daniel," she whispered, "they've arrested him. I didn't know what he was doing. I swear to you, I didn't." I stayed silent. "I have nowhere else to go," she said softly. "Can I come to you, just for a few days until I sort things out?" I could have said no. Every part of me wanted to. But against reason, I said yes. When she arrived, she looked nothing like the woman I'd known. Her hair was unkempt, her hands trembling, eyes swollen from crying. She carried only a single suitcase. I made her tea, watched her fingers shake as she lifted the cup. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than words could handle. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "I always thought love was something you could buy or control. I was wrong." Her voice cracked. Richard said he was protecting me, but he was stealing from me. From everyone. I lost everything, Daniel. Everything. But this kidney you gave me. She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. And I don't deserve that either. Something in her broke that night. She cried until she fell asleep on my couch. I stood there for a long time, watching the woman who once ruled my world crumble into something fragile and human. The next few days were quiet. She stayed in my small apartment, helping wash dishes, folding laundry, saying thank you more times than I could count. Sometimes I caught her staring at the scar on my arm, the one that matched her own, and she'd look away quickly, guilt heavy in her eyes. One afternoon, she found an old photo on my bookshelf. It was from before everything changed, me as a teenager, her and Dad on either side, laughing at something out of frame. She held it like it was made of glass. "He would hate what I became," she said quietly. "You're more like him than I ever admitted." That was the first time I saw honesty in her voice. Not manipulation, not pity, just truth. Days turned into weeks. We found a rhythm again, fragile, but real. She started cooking breakfast. I'd find her humming softly in the kitchen, something she used to do when I was a child. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as we ate dinner, she suddenly went pale. The fork slipped from her hand, clattering against the plate. I rushed to her side. Her breathing turned shallow, her pulse rapid. We rushed to the hospital. The doctor said it was stress-induced rejection. Her body was beginning to fight the kidney. She was stable for a while, but I could see her fading. The strength she once carried now lived only in her voice when she said my name. "Daniel, I don't have the strength to fight anymore. Maybe this is what I deserve." "Don't say that," I told her, gripping her hand. "You're going to be okay." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. She smiled faintly. "You gave me time to see what I'd done, to make peace. That's more than I ever gave you." She drifted to sleep, and I sat beside her, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. The machines hummed softly. For the first time, I realized how fragile the line between love and resentment truly is. I looked at her, frail and quiet, and I remembered the night she told me I wasn't part of the family. How absolute it had sounded. And now, here she was, connected to me more completely than ever before, through the heartbeat of a kidney that once belonged to her son. But the story between us wasn't done, not yet. Because the next morning, when I came back to her room, she was gone. Not dead, gone. The bed empty, the IV stand tilted, her gown neatly folded on the chair. The nurse told me she had signed herself out just after sunrise. No one knew where she went. She had left no note, no call, nothing, just disappeared. I searched every corner of the hospital, even checked the security footage. There she was, in the early gray of morning, slowly walking down the hallway in a loose sweater, her hair tied back and a paper bag in her hand. She looked calm. Too calm. Then she vanished out the front doors. The first day, I convinced myself she needed space. Maybe she didn't want to be seen weak again, didn't want me watching her fade. But by the second day, panic began to crawl inside me. I called every number I knew, her friends, her old driver, even the family lawyer. No one had heard from her. The lawyer told me quietly that after Richard's arrest, most of her accounts were frozen. She had nothing. That night, I drove to the old house, the mansion I'd grown up in. It stood silent behind its iron gates, lights off, windows empty. The place looked smaller now, haunted by its own memories. I peered through the gate, half expecting to see her shadow moving past the curtains, but there was nothing. Just the soft whistle of the wind through the trees. I was about to leave when a neighbor approached me, an older woman I vaguely remembered. She squinted through the dark, then recognized me. "You're Margaret's boy, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied quickly. "Have you seen her recently?" She hesitated. "I saw her last night walking toward the park at the end of the street. She was carrying something. Looked like a small suitcase." The park. The same place she used to take me when I was little. She'd sit on a wooden bench under the big elm tree and tell me stories about Dad, how he used to bring her coffee every morning before work. It was their spot, she said. The place where they dreamed about building the life they wanted. I drove there immediately. The park was empty, the streetlights flickering over wet pavement. The bench was still there, old and chipped, but she wasn't. All that lay on it was a folded piece of paper wrapped in plastic to keep out the dew. My name was written on it in her delicate handwriting. I tore it open with shaking hands. "Daniel, I couldn't leave this world without telling you the truth. You deserved it long ago. When your father died, I lost more than a husband. I lost my compass. Richard came when I was drowning, and I mistook his control for stability. I let him reshape everything that once mattered to me, including you. You were right about the business. I knew it was wrong. I just didn't have the courage to face losing everything again. So I turned my anger toward the one person who reminded me most of the man I betrayed, your father. I told myself I was protecting you by pushing you away, but I was only protecting my pride. The night I said you weren't part of this family, I meant it out of fear, not truth. You were always my family. You still are. If you're reading this, it means I've made peace with what's coming. The doctors didn't tell you, but I've known for weeks the kidney was failing again. I didn't want you to see it. I didn't want you to go through that pain twice. So I'm leaving quietly to a place that still feels like home. Don't look for me, my son. Live. That's all I ask. Live a life bigger than the scars I gave you, and know that wherever I am, I carry your forgiveness, even if you never gave it. Mom. My hands trembled as I finished reading. The ink was smudged as if she'd cried while writing it. I sank onto the bench, the world spinning quietly around me. Somewhere, a bird called out in the dark. For the first time in years, I cried. Not from anger, but from something heavier. Something like release.
I called the police, reported her missing, handed over the note. They promised to search. For days, nothing happened. Then, one morning, they found her car parked near the old seaside cliffs, about an hour from the city. Inside was her sweater, the same one she'd worn that morning, and an empty thermos. The ocean had taken the rest. No body was found, just silence, just absence. Months went by. Life settled into its old rhythm again, though it felt like walking through echoes. Sometimes, when I passed a mirror, I saw her eyes in mine, the same pale gray that had once burned with pride and later dimmed with regret. I kept her letter in my drawer, folded carefully, the edges worn from how many times I'd read it. Then, one afternoon, I received an envelope at the hospital. No return address, just my name written neatly. Inside was a single piece of paper, a legal document transferring ownership of something called the Davenport Trust. Attached was a handwritten note. For Daniel, from MRD. It took me a moment to understand. My mother's initials. Somehow, before she vanished, she'd transferred what little she had left into my name. I went to the lawyer, who confirmed it. She had arranged it weeks before her disappearance. The trust wasn't money, it was land. A small property by the coast, near the same cliffs where they found her car. I drove there the next weekend. The house was small, weathered by sea wind, a white cottage with blue shutters and a rusted gate. Inside, it smelled faintly of salts and lavender. On the mantel was a photograph. My father, smiling in his uniform, his arm around her shoulders. They looked young, free, untouched by everything that would come later. There was something else on the table. A small box. Inside it were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. Some dated years back, others recent. She had written to me all along, but never sent them. Letters about missing me, about guilt, about hope that someday I'd walk through her door again. Reading them felt like listening to a voice I'd long buried. It hurt, but it also healed. Outside, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the water gold. I stepped out onto the porch, feeling the breeze against my face. The wind carried the faintest echo of her voice, soft, apologetic, and real. And for the first time since that night she'd told me I wasn't part of the family, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Maybe that was enough for now. Because somewhere between what she took and what she left behind, she had given me something unexpected. Closure that didn't come with an ending, just a quiet beginning I never saw coming.
The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and quiet. I stood there watching, the sky slowly breaking open into color. It was strange how something so familiar could feel brand new. I thought of her words again, the ones from the very first letter she'd written after I left home. One day, you'll understand that love isn't about being right. It's about staying, even when it hurts. And maybe, finally, I did understand. Because as the sun rose higher, I realized that though she was gone, she hadn't left me empty. She'd left me a truth I could finally carry without pain. A truth that even the deepest wounds can become light if you let them. The sea roared softly, the horizon wide open, and I just stood there, breathing, waiting for whatever came next. The morning light stretched across the waves, spilling gold over the restless water, and I stood there until the cold numbed my feet. The sound of the sea seemed to echo through my chest, steady, endless, forgiving. For a long time, I didn't move. It felt like if I stood still enough, maybe I could feel her there, somewhere in the salt and air, watching, no longer angry, no longer afraid. When I finally turned back toward the cottage, the sun had climbed higher, painting the cliffs behind me with soft orange light. The cottage windows glowed faintly, and for a fleeting second, I almost expected to see her silhouette behind the curtain, the way she used to appear in the mornings when I was a child. Coffee in one hand, hair pinned up messily, humming a tune under her breath. The image was so vivid that I had to close my eyes to make it fade. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. I made tea, using the same chipped porcelain cup she'd left behind. The simple act felt strange, intimate, like sharing a ritual with a ghost. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching sunlight ripple through the steam. The day outside was alive. Seagulls crying, waves crashing, leaves trembling in the wind. And yet, everything inside me felt still. After a while, I began sorting through the rest of her things. There wasn't much. Some old clothes neatly folded in a chest, a few novels, a framed picture of her and my father on their wedding day. She looked radiant then, her smile soft and real, untouched by ambition or bitterness. I couldn't help but wonder what their life had been like before greed and grief had hollowed her out. Did she laugh easily? Did she ever imagine she'd end up alone in a seaside cottage, her empire gone, her son a stranger? As I packed the items into boxes, I found another envelope taped beneath a drawer, small, yellowed, and fragile with age. Inside was a deed. My father's name was written across it, dated long before she met Richard. The cottage had once belonged to him. It hit me then, this place wasn't just a refuge she found at the end. It was where everything had begun. She had come back here, to him, to their beginning, to the one part of her life that had remained uncorrupted. I sat on the floor, holding that deed, realizing that every step she had taken toward the sea was also a step backward, toward the only version of herself that had ever been pure. The sound of the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters, and for a moment it felt like the house itself was breathing. I decided to stay a little longer. I took long walks along the cliffs, visited the small town nearby, and began repairing small things around the house, the leaking faucet, the broken latch on the door. It became a quiet ritual, a way to keep her memory alive without drowning in it. Each evening, I'd sit on the porch with her letters, reading one aloud to the wind. It might have looked foolish to anyone passing by, but it felt right, as if somehow the sea carried my words back to her, letting her know I heard her, that I understood. One afternoon, I drove into the village to buy groceries. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked at me curiously when I introduced myself. "You're Margaret's son," he said, nodding slowly. "She used to come here every week, always bought the same things, tea, bread, those lemon biscuits she liked. Quiet woman, but polite. She talked about you sometimes." I froze. "She did?" He smiled faintly. "She said you were working at a hospital, helping people. She looked proud when she said it. You could tell she missed you, but she never said it directly. Some people don't know how to say what they feel, you know." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat tightened. Hearing that she'd talked about me at all felt like a small mercy, one I hadn't known I needed. When I returned to the cottage that evening, I noticed something new. The light on the porch flickered weakly, its bulb fading. I replaced it with a new one, and as it came alive, the golden glow stretched over the doorway, warm and steady. For a moment, I imagined her walking up the path, smiling faintly at the sight of the light that she used to turn on at dusk. That night, I dreamed of her. She was younger, standing by the water in a white dress, her hair blowing in the wind. She didn't speak, just smiled and pointed toward the horizon. When I followed her gaze, I saw my father there, standing in the surf, waiting. She reached for him, and together they walked into the light, hand in hand, until the sea swallowed them whole. When I woke up, the morning light was spilling through the window again, soft and golden. I sat up slowly, the dream lingering like salt on my tongue. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer owned me. I spent the rest of the day writing. Not letters, but stories. About her, about us, about everything that had happened. It started as a way to make sense of it all, but soon the words began to flow on their own. Each memory found its place. The anger, the betrayal, the love that never died no matter how much I wanted it to. When I finished, I printed the pages and placed them in a folder labeled "For Her." Then I drove back to the park, the one with the elm tree and the old wooden bench. I sat there for a long while, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the life that went on around me. It was the same bench she'd drawn in her sketchbook, the one she'd returned to alone. I set the folder on the bench and watched as the wind lifted its edges, flipping through the pages like curious fingers. I didn't leave it there forever, just for a moment, long enough to let the world touch it, long enough to feel like she might be near. When I picked it back up, the pages smelled faintly of grass and sunlight. I smiled. Somehow it felt like she'd read them already. That night, back at the cottage, I stood outside again. The stars stretched endless above the sea, bright and cold. I thought about her words, about how she wanted me to live, and I realized maybe the best way to honor her wasn't by holding on, but by moving forward, by taking everything she taught me, even through pain, and turning it into something that could heal. The tide rolled in, slow and steady, the sound like a heartbeat under the sky. I stood there, letting the wind carry through me, feeling her presence not as a weight, but as warmth, soft, invisible, eternal. And as I watched the horizon blur into darkness, I whispered to her one last time, not in anger or grief, but with quiet certainty, knowing that somehow she could hear me still, wherever she was now. I didn't even notice when I started crying. The tears fell quietly, mixing with the rain, dripping down my chin. I stood there, staring at the hospital entrance, unable to move. I could hear the sound of the automatic doors whooshing open and shut, people walking in and out, living their lives while mine felt frozen in some cruel loop of the past. My mother, lying in a hospital bed, needing a kidney, the same woman who looked me in the eye and said, "You're not part of this family anymore." Those words had buried themselves in my chest years ago, and now they echoed louder than ever. I thought about walking away, about turning around, getting on a bus, and vanishing again, like I'd done before. It would have been so easy. But something in me, maybe guilt, maybe love, maybe habit, pushed my feet forward. I walked inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant and quiet murmurs of nurses greeting me. Every step felt heavy, like the floor was made of regret. When I reached the nurses' station and asked for her room, the woman behind the desk gave me a polite smile. "Room 307, family only, please." "I'm her son," I said, almost whispering. The words came out awkwardly, like they didn't.
The corridor seemed endless. I could hear the soft beeping of machines, the rustle of sheets, the quiet breathing of people fighting battles their families prayed they'd win. My chest tightened as I reached her door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment. I was scared. Not of seeing her weak, but of seeing her strong enough to reject me again. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. She was asleep. The harsh fluorescent lights made her skin look pale, fragile. Tubes and wires wrapped around her like threads of a web she couldn't escape. For a long while, I just stood there, watching her chest rise and fall, remembering the woman she used to be, strong, proud, never wrong. My throat burned as I whispered, "Hi, Mom." Her eyes fluttered open, hazy at first, and then wide with disbelief. "Ethan?" Her voice cracked on my name. I nodded, unsure whether to step closer or stay away. "You came." "I heard about your condition," I said quietly. She looked at me, tears already forming. They told me you were a match." "I am." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. I could feel her searching for words, but she didn't know which ones to choose. Apologies, maybe? Or excuses? Maybe both. "I didn't expect you to come," she whispered finally. "Neither did I," I replied, sitting down on the chair beside her bed. She looked older than I remembered, lines carved deep into her face, her hair thinner, her eyes softer. The woman who once ruled our home with unshakable authority now looked like someone defeated by time. I wanted to hate her, to hold on to the anger that had kept me alive all these years. But sitting there, I felt something else. Pity. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said suddenly. Her voice trembled, raw and unfamiliar. "For everything I said, for how I treated you." I stared at her, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "You told me I wasn't your son anymore. You made sure everyone believed that." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong. I was angry and scared. When your father left, I needed someone to blame. You were the only one there." I laughed bitterly. "So you punished me for his mistakes?" She didn't answer. The silence between us said enough. I wanted her to feel the pain I'd felt, the nights I'd slept on park benches, the years I'd spent building a life she never cared to ask about. But watching her now, hooked up to machines, I realized punishment wouldn't fix anything. "I can't change what happened," she said softly, "but I can ask for a chance to make things right." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I saw the woman who used to hold my hand when I was scared of thunderstorms, the woman who taught me how to ride a bike, who sat up all night when I had a fever. That woman had existed once, buried under pride and anger. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, "but I'll help you." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's more than I deserve." The doctor came in soon after, explaining the procedure, the risks, the timeline. My mother kept looking at me like she couldn't believe I was real. When the doctor asked if I was ready for the tests, I said yes, without hesitation. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, doing something that would let me move on, even if she couldn't. Later that night, when they took my blood sample, the nurse smiled faintly. "You're doing a good thing," she said. I didn't answer, because deep down, I wasn't sure if I was doing it out of goodness or closure. Back in the waiting area, I sat alone, staring out the window at the dark city. Every light seemed to tell a different story. People laughing, fighting, forgiving. Families. Something I hadn't felt part of in a long time. My phone buzzed with a message from my sister, Ava. "She's scared, Ethan. More than she'll admit. Thank you for coming." I didn't reply. I couldn't. When I returned to her room later, she was awake again, staring out the same window. She turned when she heard me. "Do you remember that night it rained so hard the power went out?" she asked me suddenly. I frowned, caught off guard. "Do you mean when I was 8? She smiled faintly. "You were terrified of the thunder. You crawled into my bed and told me you'd protect me." Her eyes glistened. "You were always like that. Kind. Too kind for me." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe she meant it. Maybe she did. But words had a way of losing their meaning after years of silence. As I stood there, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process. And maybe, just maybe, this was where it began. But before I could say anything, the door opened and Ava stepped in, her eyes wide as she saw me standing there. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "they're ready for you." I nodded, my legs feeling like they were made of stone as I followed Ava out of the room. The hallway seemed longer this time, the light harsher, the air colder. She walked beside me quietly, glancing at me now and then like she was afraid I'd disappear before we reached the surgical wing. The silence between us carried all the years we hadn't spoken, the birthdays missed, the letters never sent, the pain that had filled the spaces where love should have been. When I reached the end of the corridor, Ava finally spoke. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Mom doesn't expect you to."
Ava didn't respond. We just stood there for a moment, the fluorescent lights buzzing above us, the distant echo of footsteps down the hall. Then she reached out and touched my arm. "I know it's hard, Ethan, but maybe this is the only way any of us can heal. You, her, me, all of us." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: sincerity, the kind that makes your chest ache. I wanted to say something back, something that made sense, but the words wouldn't come, so I just nodded. The nurse met me at the end of the hall and handed me a form to sign. My name looked strange on the paper, like it didn't belong next to hers. Donor, Ethan Ross. Recipient, Margaret Ross. I stared at those words for a long time, thinking about how life had a twisted sense of irony. They told me the surgery would be scheduled for the next morning. I'd stay overnight for prep and observation. Ava hugged me before she left, her arms trembling around me. It felt foreign, that warmth, like something I'd forgotten how to receive. That night, in the quiet of the hospital room, sleep refused to come. Machines beeped faintly down the hall, nurses murmured in low voices, and I lay there staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything: the fights, the shouting, the day she told me to leave. I remembered the look on her face when I packed my things: cold, unshaken, final. I'd stood in the doorway waiting for her to stop me. She never did. And yet here I was, about to give her a piece of myself. Around midnight, there was a knock on the door. I turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway, leaning weakly on the frame, hospital gown draped loosely over her. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I sat up, nodding. She shuffled in slowly, her IV stand rolling beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked at me the way people look at ghosts, with disbelief and regret. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally. "I just kept thinking, what if you didn't come?" "You would have found someone else," I replied. She shook her head. "No, I don't think I would have." Her voice was fragile, like glass. "I wanted to tell you something before tomorrow." I waited, unsure if I even wanted to hear it. "I was proud of you," she said quietly. "Always was. I just didn't know how to show it after your father left. He broke something in me, Ethan, something I didn't know how to fix. And when I looked at you, I saw him, his face, his voice, everything. It hurt so much that I tried to erase you instead." Her confession hit harder than I expected. I stared at her, my chest tightening. "So you punished me for looking like him?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, and it's the worst thing I've ever done. Every day after you left, I waited for the phone to ring, for you to walk through the door, but I knew I didn't deserve it." I swallowed hard. "You don't get to just erase 10 years with an apology, Mom." "I know," she whispered. "But maybe we can start with tomorrow. Maybe we can start with this." Her hand reached out, trembling, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I took it. It was cold, frail, but real. Something in me loosened when I felt her squeeze back, weak but genuine. We sat there like that for a long time, not saying anything, just breathing the same air again after so many years of silence. When the nurse came in and gently reminded her she needed rest, she stood slowly, but before leaving, she turned back to me. "Ethan," she said softly, "thank you. No matter what happens tomorrow, thank you." After she left, I lay back down, staring into the darkness. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible or if love could survive the kind of damage we'd done to each other. But I knew this. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest felt lighter. The next morning came too soon. Bright lights, soft voices, the smell of antiseptic. I changed into the sterile gown, signed more forms, and tried not to think about what came next. Ava appeared beside me just before they wheeled me toward the operating room. Her eyes were red, her hand shaking as she took mine. "She's praying for you," she quietly said. I smiled faintly. "That's a first." "She means it this time," Ava whispered. The last thing I saw before the anesthesia blurred my vision was the ceiling light spinning slowly above me. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, and just before everything went black, I thought I heard a voice, faint, trembling, familiar, saying, "I love you, Ethan." When I woke, everything was white and silent. My throat was dry, my body heavy, and there was a dull ache in my side. I blinked slowly, trying to piece together where I was. Then I heard it, a soft sound, like a sob, from the next bed. I turned my head, and there she was, pale, weak, but alive. My mother. Her eyes met mine, and she started crying. "You're okay," she whispered through her tears. "You're okay." For the first time in years, she said it, not like an accusation, not like a burden, but like a blessing. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't have to," I said flatly. "Just don't waste it." She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding mine in the dim light. "I won't. I promise." We didn't say anything else for the rest of the night. But at some point, I realized she had fallen asleep, her breathing even and soft. I watched her for a long time, remembering how I used to watch her from my bedroom doorway when I was little, waiting for her to notice me, to call me in, to tell me everything was okay. Maybe it wasn't too late for that. Maybe. Morning light crept into the room, painting the walls gold. The pain in my side had dulled, replaced by a strange calm. I heard footsteps in the hall, nurses starting rounds, carts rolling, voices calling out room numbers, and then I heard her whisper my name. "Ethan?" I turned my head. She was awake again, her voice steadier this time. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Sure." "When I was in surgery, before they put me under," she said quietly, "I kept thinking about that day, the day I told you to leave." My stomach twisted. "Why?" "Because I realized," she continued, her voice trembling, "that it was the day I lost everything. Not just you, but who I was supposed to be. I thought I was protecting this family from falling apart, but I was the one who broke it. I told myself I did it out of strength, but it was fear. Pure fear." Her words hit like a slow, deep ache. I didn't know how to respond. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with the edge of her blanket. "When the doctors told me about my kidneys, I prayed. I hadn't done that in years. And I said, if there's any chance to fix what I destroyed, please give me that chance. Then they said you were a match." Her eyes met mine again, full of tears, yes, but also something else. Humility. Maybe even peace. "I don't think it's coincidence that it was you," she whispered. "It's grace." I wanted to scoff, to say something bitter, but I couldn't. Her voice carried too much truth. I'd spent years hardening myself against her, and yet, right now, I felt something inside me thawing. "Maybe," I said finally. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. "You're a good man, Ethan. Better than I ever was." "I don't know about that." "I do," she said firmly. "You proved it the moment you walked back through that door." The nurse entered then to check our vitals, and my mother fell silent, but her eyes never left me. When the nurse left again, I could still feel that gaze on me, heavy with regret and something resembling love. A few days later, when they finally let me sit up properly, she was wheeled into my room again. She looked stronger already. The color was coming back to her cheeks. She reached out her hand and placed it over mine. She asked softly, "Do you think that we could try again? Maybe start over?" I looked at her hand resting on mine, the same hand that once slammed doors, pointed in anger, pushed me away. Now it trembled, asking for a second chance. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window, the sun pouring through the glass, blinding and warm. I could hear birds outside, faint but real. Life moving on. "Maybe we could," I said finally. She squeezed my hand gently, and for the first time since I was a child, I didn't pull away.
"I want more of those," she said, voice trembling. "With you, if you'll let me." The way she said it, like she was asking permission to breathe again, made something inside me give way. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Over the next few weeks, our recovery turned into a routine. She'd sit beside my bed in the mornings while I drank coffee, talking about small things, neighbors, weather, her favorite books. She started remembering little details about my life, things she'd never cared to ask before. I found myself talking back, telling her about the years she'd missed, about the apartment I'd built from scratch, the job I'd worked to survive. She listened, really listened, her eyes never drifting away. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, she'd look at me like she was memorizing every detail, as if afraid that forgiveness might vanish if she blinked. One afternoon, Ava brought in a small potted plant for her bedside. "A new start," she said, setting it between our beds. Mom smiled at that, brushing her fingers over the leaves. "Maybe we'll keep this one alive," she joked. "Maybe," I said, smiling back. But something about that plant, the way it sat there, soaking in sunlight, made me think of how fragile second chances were. You had to tend to them, water them, make sure they didn't wither under neglect. By the time we were discharged, we had both changed. She walked a little slower, spoke a little softer, and for the first time, she didn't seem to carry that invisible wall of pride around her. As for me, I wasn't sure what I felt. I didn't know if I could call it forgiveness yet, but it was close. Like the quiet before a storm breaks and the air smells clean again. When the nurse wheeled her out toward the car, she reached for my hand and held it tightly. "You'll come home for a while, won't you?" she asked. I hesitated. The word home felt heavy on my tongue. "I'll think about it." She nodded, not pushing further. That, more than anything, told me she'd changed. Days passed after that. I stayed in a small apartment near the hospital, recovering on my own. She called every evening, sometimes just to ask how I was feeling, sometimes to share a memory. One night, her voice was quieter than usual. She said, "The house feels too big without you." I replied, "Maybe it always was." There was a pause. Then she said, "Then maybe it's time to fill it again." I didn't answer right away. But something about the way she said it, soft, uncertain, almost pleading, stayed with me long after I hung up. A week later, I found myself standing in front of that old house. The garden was gone, but the swing was still there, hanging crooked from the oak tree. The paint was chipped, the ropes frayed, but it was standing, like it had been waiting. She opened the door before I could knock. For a second, we just stared at each other,
unsure what to do. Then she stepped aside, her voice trembling. "Welcome home, Ethan." And for the first time in years, I stepped through that door without anger in my chest. The smell of old wood and coffee wrapped around me like something familiar, something almost safe. She closed the door softly behind me, her eyes glistening, and for a moment we just stood there, not as enemies or strangers, but as two people finally brave enough to face what had been broken. The days after the surgery blurred into a haze of painkillers, slow recovery, and the sterile scent of hospital air. But within that haze, something delicate and uncertain began to grow. Something like peace. My mother lay in the hospital bed beside mine, her color returning, her breathing steadier. The doctors said the surgery was a success. "Your son saved your life," one of them told her gently, as if he were speaking to a child who didn't yet understand the weight of that truth. She turned her face toward me, pale but alive. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice breaking halfway through. I just nodded. There were no words for everything between us. The years of silence, the words like knives, the ache that had settled deep inside me long before her illness. But as she looked at me, her eyes shimmered with something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Not the shallow kind that people use to make peace with guilt, but the raw, bleeding kind that comes when someone finally sees what they've destroyed. Recovery wasn't easy for either of us. The pain came in waves, sometimes physical, sometimes emotional. I'd find myself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd done the right thing. She had torn me out of her life once. Would she do it again? But then I'd remember the way her hand trembled when she reached for mine after the surgery. How she held on as if afraid I might disappear before she woke. On the third night, she asked me something I wasn't ready for. "Why did you do it?" I stared at her. The answer wasn't simple. Because she was my mother? Because no matter how much I'd tried to hate her, some part of me still wanted her to love me? Or because I wanted to prove, to her, to myself, that I was better than the person she believed I was? Maybe it was all of that. Maybe it didn't matter. "Because you needed me," I finally said, "and I couldn't watch you die." She turned her head toward the window. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. Weeks later, when we were discharged, she insisted I come home with her. "Just until you recover fully," she said softly, as if afraid I'd say no. I almost did, but something in her tone, fragile, unsure, almost pleading, made me hesitate. So I went. The house hadn't changed much. Same framed photos on the walls, except the ones of me were gone. I didn't mention it, and neither did she. At first, we spoke in short, careful sentences, like strangers forced to share a roof. But slowly the ice began to crack. One evening, she brought out a photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. There I was, 5 years old, covered in mud, grinning with missing teeth. There I was again 10 years old, holding a birthday cake while she laughed beside me. Her fingers brushed over the page, trembling slightly. She said quietly, "I kept them all. Even when I said I didn't want to see you anymore, I lied. I couldn't throw them away." The words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many years convincing myself she didn't care that I'd forgotten what it felt like to believe she might. Over time, we began to rebuild. Not perfectly. There were too many cracks for that. but enough to start. She apologized often, in small ways, more than big ones, cooking my favorite food, leaving notes, asking about my life without judgment. Each gesture was like a stitch closing an old wound. But the real moment of change came one quiet evening. We were sitting on the porch, the sun sinking low. She said, "You know, when I told you you weren't part of this family anymore, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was teaching you a lesson about loyalty. But now I see I was punishing you for my own pain, for your father leaving, for everything I couldn't control. You were just the easiest one to hurt." Her voice broke. "And you still gave me your kidney. You still saved me." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the cold woman who had turned me away. I saw someone human, flawed, frightened, weak maybe, but also capable of love, even if she had buried it under years of pride. I said quietly, "I didn't do it to save you. I did it to save myself, to let go of the hate. It was killing me more than it ever hurt you." She nodded, her tears glistening in her eyes. Maybe we both needed saving. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. We still argued. We still stumbled over the past. But the difference was, we tried. For the first time in my life, my mother tried to understand me. And I tried to forgive her, not because she...
Sometimes life brings us back to the very people who broke us, not for revenge or validation, but to finish an unfinished sentence, to prove that the past doesn't define who we are. What we choose next does. My mother and I never became the picture of a perfect family, but one evening, as we sat watching the rain trace silver lines down the window, she reached out and held my hand. No words, no apologies, just silence, and the rhythm of her breathing beside mine. In that silence, I realized something extraordinary. Forgiveness isn't about saying, "It's okay." It's about finally being strong enough to stop waiting for an apology that might never come. It's about choosing peace over pain, love over bitterness. And sometimes it's about giving a piece of yourself, literally, to the person who once tore you apart, only to find that in losing something, you finally become whole.